Hello, welcome back to The Professor Speaks. I'm Dr. Rafael Chacón, Professor of Art History and Criticism at the University of Montana in Missoula, Montana in the Western United States. It's a pleasure to welcome you back to our series on Roman and early Christian art. And we are discussing in this section, we're discussing the Emperor Hadrian and his great achievements. So this is the second part two of a two-part series on Hadrian. The first part we dealt with his biography, a very interesting and colorful character in Roman history. And the second part we're going to be dealing with his architecture, that is Hadrian the builder, the great designer that he was as an emperor. So without much ado, let's go ahead and share the screen and open up our PowerPoint presentation so that we can begin discussing Hadrian the builder. So you might recognize this building immediately. This is the famous Pantheon. We're going to be discussing this a little bit later in the discussion. This is one of the most celebrated buildings in Rome. In fact, it's one of the most celebrated buildings in the Western heritage altogether. It was designed by the emperor himself, Hadrian. So we'll talk about this building shortly. But first, I want to take you out of Rome to not far from Rome. This is, in fact, the ancient site of Tibur. It's now the modern Tivoli. And it was there between the year 118 and 138 that the Emperor Hadrian built a spectacular villa. And this is Hadrian's personal home, if you will, his home, away from the capital city of Rome. And if you remember, Hadrian had rural roots. He comes from the Hispanic Peninsula, so he comes from Spain, near the town of Italica. So it's entirely possible that what he was doing in building Tibur, this wonderful villa, that he was recreating some of the landscape of his childhood, that is the countryside, the hills, and it was there at modern day Tivoli where he built a fabulous villa. And here you can see a map of that site from the air. It featured an incredible array of buildings. And as far as we know, Hadrian had a direct hand in the design of this complex, this enormous villa complex, including many of the structures that are there today. And in fact, if we study those buildings, what we begin to see are some patterns of the kinds of architecture that interested the emperor, which he built not only here, but in other sites throughout the empire. And here is an artist's reconstruction of that sprawling complex. Again, it's on a hillside, or excuse me, a hillock, and many of the facilities, the buildings, the amenities that Hadrian designed for this place are indeed located on this hilly location. And right off the bat, you can see that that there was a theater here down in the lower part of your screen, a number of different courtyarded areas, gardens, and that sort of thing, and then a lot of more intimate spaces, so for housing. But spread amongst the grounds were also temples, water basins like the ones that you see here, all kinds of amenities for the emperor to enjoy. And if you remember, the only emperor to have built anything like this prior to Hadrian was Nero. And of course, he built this at the southern end of the Roman Forum, to the chagrin of many Romans. And of course, that was wiped out by Vespasian and the successor emperors. But so in some ways, Hadrian was wise to build his villa complex, his personal home, outside the city in a rural place like Tibur. So again, here's a model showing us some of the amenities that were a part of that complex. Lots of complicated architecture, lots of arcaded courtyards like you see here in the center of this composition, many of them with basins or pools. So it was really a pleasure dome, and it was one of the most elaborate, extensive royal palaces in history, certainly Roman history. And this is what the site looks like today. These are some of the magnificent ruins that you see there at Tibur. And right off the bat, you'll notice that there were a lot of vaulted buildings. So many of these buildings were built out of brick. often using concrete, which was, of course, a preferred Roman way of creating vaults. And then the other important detail are the pavements, and you can't quite see them in this image, but you'll see them shortly. That the pavings, particularly the mosaic floors, were very important at this site. So elaborate architecture, luxurious interiors and vaulting, and surfaces such as mosaics and marbles riveting the walls or covering the walls of this palatial complex. Here we see in this black and white photograph some of the complex vaulting that took place at Tibur. So imagine that these vaults were at one time covered in beautifully appointed stucco or plaster work, painted in relief in some cases, or the wall surfaces covered with fancy marbles of many different colors and varieties. And then, of course, the flooring would have been either marble, slabs of marble, or mosaic work, which was the preferred way of Roman patricians covering their floors. But there are some very distinctive forms here that allude to some of Hadrian's travels. And I mentioned in part one that Hadrian was a traveler, and that he as an itinerant emperor, he traveled and saw a great many monuments throughout the Roman Empire, the Mediterranean basin. This is a structure known as the Canopus, and as you can see, it's a very large pool at Tibur, and this was built sometime between 125 and 128. It is indeed just a large water basin, a large pool, but it was surrounded by a colonnade, and here you see the fragments of that colonnade that had been re-erected. And in between these alternating arched structures, there were, in fact, monumental pieces of sculpture, often images of heroes and gods and goddesses. For example, here on the left in this photograph, what you see are a series of caryatids. And the caryatids were these female figures that literally held up temples in the ancient Greek world. And remember, this is also part of Hadrian's Philhellenism, or his Hellenophilism. Either way, it means that essentially he loved the Greek world. And so collecting Greek sculpture, Greek types of sculpture, recreating those in his own architectural spaces was very much a part of his artistic or his aesthetic agenda. So here we see these Greek caryatids, not unlike those that we see in the Acropolis, the high hill above the city of Athens, where its major temples were located. And then other sculptures of different gods and goddesses surrounding this courtyard, or cortile, as the Italians would describe it. There was, at the end of this beautiful basin of water, a space. And there was, in fact, a Serapium, a temple, a healing center for the emperor and his court or his family. And that idea of the Canopus and the Serapium together is actually an allusion to the architecture that he saw and experienced while in Egypt. And if you remember, Egypt was one of those destinations that was very important to the emperor on his sojourns around the empire. So what we have here in Rome is a Roman version of architecture that existed, even temples that existed in Egypt, brought and recreated in the Roman guise at his villa at Tibur. This is the Triclinium. Again, this is an outdoor dining facility or dining room that you see under that hemisphere or that vault that you see there at the end of the Canopus, or this large pool. Think of this as a kind of healing center for the emperor, who in his last days was rather infirm. And so it was here where he was treated by his doctors, his physicians, his healers, his massage therapists, if you will, who attended to his every need. And this was also, of course, a spiritual place, so a place of spiritual healing as well. And these are, what you're looking at here, are some of the sculptures that surround the Canopus and the Serapium. And these are copies. The originals are in museums. But these are copies of the actual sculptures that were found here as the site was excavated in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Again, another detail of the end of that Canopus opposite the triclinium, or the dining hall, or the dining room, the outdoor dining room that we see on the Canopus. There were all around the villa major pieces of sculpture, including large-scale sculpture. So, for example, here is a detail of one of Ulysses' companions, the navigators, the sailors who traveled with Ulysses on his famous journeys across the Mediterranean. And here we see one of those men being devoured by a sea monster, a Scylla. And these sculptures were set up in dioramas, sort of marble, brightly painted figural groups that showed the ancient Greek gods and the heroes in all kinds of activities. So this is a scene out of the story of Ulysses, recreated here in large-scale, over life-size sculptures at the villa at Tibur. Again, it's part of the emperor indulging in his taste and his interest in Greek mythology, the Greek heroes, the Greek stories, the Greek gods. But as we discussed in our last discussion, that his lover Antinous died by drowning in the Nile River in Egypt, and it was there that at the site where he drowned that the emperor created a new city called Antonopoulos, which became a center for the worship of Antinosiris, that is, this conflated god who was both Roman, a Roman actual personage, now deified, conflated with the Egyptian god Osiris. And so these sculptures that you see here that come from Tibur allude to that Egyptian connection in the life of the Emperor Hadrian. So lots of images of Antinous on the site, the lover who presumably also enjoyed the villa at points of his life. And then lots of allusions to him now as the dead but deified Antinosiris. The architecture at Tibur is fascinating, and it is actually an incredible array of structures from that 2nd century AD. Roman building types, some of them quite innovative, and it's hard not to attribute those innovations to the emperor himself. Of course, an individual like him who had traveled widely across the Mediterranean basin up into Northern Europe was able to see the vast array of architecture. His travels in the Near East, his travels to Egypt also exposed him to all kinds of building traditions. So he was obviously a very well cultivated architect. And some of those lessons are apparent in the architecture that you see here, which is actually exotic, but also quite sumptuous and elaborate. So these are just some details of that. We don't have the time to actually look at the villa extensively in detail, but we can actually point out some of the highlights, if you will, of this site. For example, here is a circular island that is surrounded by a sort of moat, which was surrounded by a colonnade, so a circular structure. A building, if you will, on an island, completely artificial, surrounded by water. So you can imagine what this space looks like. And in a minute, I'll give you one of those imaginings. And then attached to it were, in fact, the thermae, or the baths, that were, of course, cold water, warm water, tepid water, and hot water, plumbed for the delectation and the use and the healing of the emperor and his court. So these structures were, of course, very significant throughout the Roman world, but here they have a particularly grand character to them. And of course, the emperor had access to the best architects and the best designers, the best engineers, and the best artists to appoint this site. And you see actually the structure that I was just discussing right here on the upper right side of the screen. If I can pull up my pointer, there you see that villa and the baths attached to them, to that circular floating villa structure, if you will. And this is what it looks like today. So the colonnade is in ruins, but enough of it has been re-erected so that it gives you a sense of what you could expect. Of course, this had a vaulted ceiling, which is now gone. The island in the middle with its own buildings, habitable buildings in the middle. And of course, the superstructures are now gone, but we have the foundations and therefore the plan for that space. Here's another view of the colonnade, the circular colonnade that surrounded the moat. And imagine, of course, that this was roofed over at some point in its day. And this is what architects today, modern designers, envision that space to have looked like. Again, beautiful floors, beautiful surfaces, beautiful marble columns, in almost a kind of textbook arrays of the Greek and classical orders. And then the structure on the right, that island building in the middle, a place for the emperor to gather with his friends and guests and members of his family and court. The ruins are elaborate and they're extensive, and there's enough detail there left to tell us, in fact, that this was a sumptuous place, perhaps even more sumptuous than what Nero built in Rome, Nero's Domus Aurea, or the golden house. For example, here you see in the black and white photograph some of the stucco work, just a fragment of it in those squinches, the corners of those vaults as they as they descended down the walls of this space. These spaces are parts of the bath, particularly the Heliocaminus, one of the details of the bath complex. Here is, in fact, a ruined temple. This was a temple, a circular temple to the goddess Venus. And of course, there's a sculpture of Venus there, a copy of a famous Greek sculpture of the goddess herself. So many smallish but important temples in the Greco-Roman Pantheon were located at the emperor's villa. There are details of, and many of the details of the villa were removed in earlier times and framed up and put on exhibit in various museums, particularly in Rome. For example, at the Capitoline Museum, the museum on top of the Capitoline Hill today, you can find fragments of the flooring and the wall mosaics that once beautifully appointed the villa at Tivoli, or at ancient Tibur. These are two scenes, for example, and they have been framed up like paintings today, but imagine that these were once part of the floors, elaborate, extensive flooring built out of small tesserae or chips of colored stones and tiles. This is a scene on the left of a lion attacking a bull, so cattle. And then on the right, we have an image of a shrine and some goats. And there should be somewhere in the image also a goat herd. But there on the right, you see a shrine to a goddess and the goats sort of lounging near a stream. These are not paintings, or they are paintings, but done as mosaics. So these are indeed mosaic works made out of thousands of small tiles pieced together to form the colorful images that you see here. And it gives you a sense of the richness and the wealth that was at this extensive villa complex outside of the city proper. This gorgeous image, again, is not a painting in the traditional sense of oil on a canvas or oil on board. This is actually made out of millions of small pieces of cut stone. The pattern that you see around it, the image of these doves drinking out of a beautiful bronze or brass basin, that image is constructed out of millions of small chips, and I think you can see that here. They almost look like pixelation in a modern digital image today. These are all very tiny pieces together that were fitted together to form the extensive imagery that you see in those mosaics. These are more basic, but they're still quite lovely and quite sumptuous in their extent. And these are the pavements of the hospitalia, so the guest quarters of the palace proper. So again, these are in black and white. They're more abstract, more just simple geometric patterning, but it gives you a sense of how extensive the mosaic work were as a part of the flooring system of the villa itself. And again, this kind of thing also existed in Rome. In the patrician homes in the royal palaces in Rome. But of course, many of those structures were built over, have not survived. And at Tibur, a site that has been excavated, we can see the extent to which this art form was mattered to the emperor and his designers and architects and artists. Here's some more beautiful patterning, sometimes quite elaborate in its geometry or its floral patterning, a very, very important art form that you see at Tivoli. To what extent the emperor had a hand in those designs, we don't know. But you can imagine that he was surrounded by quite a talented pool of individuals who worked with him to make this place the grandiose luxury palace that it was. Here we see that model, famous model, Italo Gismondi's model of the city of Rome in the 4th century. But I want to take you to show you that there are other very important structures here that are identified with this emperor. Some of them located in the Roman Forum and elsewhere throughout the city. For example, there is a very, very large temple that was built by the emperor just north and west of the Colosseum that you see here, the Flavian Amphitheater. And that temple is a temple dedicated to the gods Venus and Rome, 2 separate deities. There was, in fact, a goddess known as Roma by this time. And that double temple had shrines back to these twin goddesses. And it's a massive, massive structure. So if people resent the fact that the Roman Forum had been built up by earlier emperors, including Nero, they certainly would add to their resentments, because this is an incredibly large temple sitting on an enormous platform, this enormous colonnade or forest of columns supporting a massive, massive structure. And this was built during the reign of Hadrian to celebrate these twin goddesses, I should say, Venus and Rome. And here are some more details of that. Very little of this temple survives except for the platform itself, the substructure. And then what you see are some remnants of those columns that once supported this massive, massive roofing of this twin temple. And there you see the apses that once contained the effigies or the statues of the goddesses Rome and Venus. There's also some pavement here that you can still see today when you visit the site of the Roman Forum. Some more views giving us a sense of the scale and the grandiosity of this temple built now at the end of just before you reach the area of the Colosseum and the great colossal statue that was once there. So again, that temple is down here in the southeastern portion of the Roman Forum. If you go farther north and you go past the Capitoline Hill and you continue on to this low area known as the Campus Martius, you will also find another very important Hadrianic monument, and that is the wonderful building known as the Pantheon. There's also a temple to Hadrian himself, as you see here. But for now, let's focus on this wonderful building known as the Pantheon. And this is a very unique building in Roman history. The fact that it has survived virtually intact these 2,000 years is truly miraculous. This is not just an important building for Roman history, for the life of Hadrian. It's an important building architecturally in general, in some ways codifying many of Hadrian's ideas about architecture, but also sort of firming up what was known to be good and true about classical architecture in the day. This was built between 118 to 125. And even though the inscription in bronze here says built by Agrippa, it was not. It was built by Hadrian. What is true is that there was once a temple here, a temple to all the gods, a pantheon, that is a temple to all the gods, that Agrippa did in fact build, but that temple burned down. And when it burned down, Hadrian had the opportunity to rebuild it. And so the inscription on it that says that Agrippa built this is Hadrian's being modest, essentially. Hadrian, in fact, built and probably, more than likely, designed the building as well. And here is what the building looked like in its time. It was, in fact, a circular structure with this wonderful vaulted dome. with a temple entrance or a temple facade, as if you were entering a typical Greco-Roman temple. And yet it was different because, in fact, it was a circular temple. And of course, that circular spherical, those spherical forms were important symbolically to this concept of a temple to all the gods. And if in front of it was, in fact, a courtyard. That doesn't exist any longer. It's been built up now. But at one point, there was, in fact, a colonnade or stoa, to use the Greek term, that, in fact, prepared the visitor for the entry to the temple proper. So the original was built in 27 to 25 BC, and it was built indeed by Agrippa, rebuilt by Domitian in the year 80, destroyed by fire in 110, and then it was redesigned, rebuilt by Hadrian, and that is the building that we see today. It's not intact, but enough of it is there to give us a sense of the magnificence of Roman buildings in the 2nd century AD. And it's also fair to say that that building, that domed structure, which has survived into modern times, has influenced every single domed building built in Christian Europe, in the Muslim West, and in the Jewish world. It has, in fact, influenced many, many buildings, all dome buildings in the Western world since. So it is a very, very important structure in our history. The interior is hard to photograph, although there are countless photographs online today because millions of tourists have actually entered and stood underneath this oculus, or this eye that opens up to the heavens above, stood beneath the concrete vaults of that massive domed structure. Since it can't be photographed very well from the inside, I thought I'd offer an 18th century painting, which does a pretty good job of telling you what that interior is like. And remember, it was a temple, and it was in fact used as a temple, visited by Romans, where they would see statues or effigies in shrines to their gods. And then above that, this beautiful ceiling, which, by the way, was covered, these coffers were actually covered in copper, which were gilded. So there was actually metal in these coffers. And of course, those were stripped off the building when the city was ransacked in its demise in the 5th and 6th centuries. But the building itself today gives you a sense of how magnificent this was in its day, how much more magnificent it was in its day. The porch, that temple entrance, has 20 Egyptian columns. Those were brought in from Egypt. They're basalt. There used to be bronze doors on the front of the building, and those were melted down in the 17th century to build the columns that you see above the altar at St. Peter's on the Vatican Hill today. There are many, many details that I won't go into that make this structure unique in its history. But what is really important about it is not just its shape, its design, but the fact that it was built out of mostly concrete and then finished with beautiful marbles. And of course, it's that hemispheric dome with the oculus, the eye above, that truly makes the building a magnificent structure. And it might also indicate why the vaulting, those circular and semicircular vaults, were so important in the buildings that we see at Tivoli or at ancient Tibur. Here's a cross section showing us what that building looks like. Massive, massive walls down at the base. They form a drum, and then the walls thin out as they become the dome, the vaulted dome. And again, this is poured concrete. This is actually a massive forest of trees had to be built inside as scaffolding to support the coffering and the concrete structure that was built as the covering, the most noble covering for this ancient temple. And again, here's the temple entrance with its great columns, those Egyptian basalt columns that preceded the entrance to the temple proper. There is, as I mentioned earlier, a temple to Hadrian. This was built after his death, and this is this is now the stock exchange in modern day Rome. At least the stock exchange was built around the Temple of Hadrian, of which one flank of it still exposed as it was in antiquity. And this is in the northern end of the campus Martius, and you can see that today when you visit the capital city. This is what that temple looked like, and much like the Pantheon, the temple to all the gods, this building also was surrounded by a colonnade, a kind of preparatory space for the actual visit to the sacred site. That idea of an atrium or a courtyard to prepare the viewer or the pilgrim was very much a part of Roman building traditions. It created a kind of sacred precinct surrounding the sacred structure. And there we see a bust portrait of the emperor overlooking the temple that was dedicated in his honor to his deified person. Now, there is another building associated with Hadrian, and it is the all too famous Castel SantAngelo in Rome today. And this, of course, is identified. It's on the other side of the Tibur, so it is not in Rome. Remember that that Rome is on the right side of the Tibur here. What is on the left side is the neighborhoods below the Vatican Hill. Those were outside the city. And of course, one would build your mausoleum not within the city itself, but outside the city. And outside the city, on the edges of the Tiber River, was where a mausoleum was built for Hadrian. And it is a massive, massive structure. It is known today as the Castel SantAngelo because of this bridge that you see here, much, much later built over Roman bridge, an original Roman bridge, but it has these angels on it. And then, of course, that's what gave this castle its name, the Castel SantAngelo. And there is, of course, an angel over the mausoleum, a Christian angel over that structure today. It is a warren inside of spaces that have been elaborated and built up over the centuries, particularly in the Middle Ages and in the early modern period. So the fortifications, the crenellations that you see surrounding it, and some of the superstructure, this is all additions to the original structure, which was built in commemoration of, and actually to house the ruins of Hadrian. And this is what one of the interior passages looks like. And of course, this building is now associated with papal history, the history of the popes on the Vatican Hill. This was a palace used by the popes, and there are some beautiful spaces here built by the later Christian, the leaders of the Christian church. However, all over the empire, if you travel across the Mediterranean basin and even up into Germania or Germany, you will find Hadrianic monuments. This was an emperor who liked to build and rebuild. And as I mentioned in our earlier lecture about him, he often renovated ancient sites, particularly in Greece and Asia Minor, and also Egypt, rededicated temples, reorganized the priesthoods that tended to those places. He was a very, very active builder as emperor. And then in addition to the things that he built himself during his reign, there were monuments built to him or built in his honor. And so, for example, there is a gate there in the city of Antalya in what was once ancient Anatolia in modern day Turkey. And then on the right, we have a gate identified with Hadrian and his rule in Athens, a city that was beloved to this emperor. So the capital of Greece. And then, of course, among the most famous Hadrianic monuments is Hadrian's Wall. And here is just a small section of it that courses across the British Isles, in England and in Scotland. And here we see Hadrian's Wall that was begun between in the year 122 and continued to be built for the rest of the emperor's life. There's another Roman wall built by a later emperor in 142. This is known as the Antonine Wall. That one is less well known than Hadrian's Wall. And this wall was literally built as a fortification to prevent, in fact, the barbaric tribes, the local indigenous tribes, from penetrating into the settled areas of the Roman world in the southern British Isles. And with that, we will end our discussion about the wonderful reign of the Emperor Hadrian. thanks again for joining us on this journey. And I look forward to seeing you again at our next discussion when we continue discussing Roman and early Christian art. And don't forget to like us on YouTube. Thank you.